The political theory of the Republic is a paradigm example of a top-down philosophy, starting in the Empyrean heights of intellectual definitions and then proceeding downwards with, for the most part, a sublime disregard for the actualities of human social and political life. Indeed, Plato's theory is, says George Sabine, far too much dominated by a single idea and far too simple to do justice to Plato's subject, the political life of the city-state. This might explain why Plato felt it necessary to return to the subject in a partial way in The Statesman and at great and tedious length in the Laws. Truth to tell, The Statesman, despite its name, is not so much a treatise on politics or statesmanship as it is an exercise in Platonic dialectic, with the statesman as the object of its dialectical search. I will take from it what I can, concentrating most of my effort on the Laws. It is generally agreed that the literary quality of Plato's later works, in particular that of the Laws, is far below that of the Republic. In fact, on first reading, it's hard to believe that the two dialogues were the same person. The Laws is a dialogue more in name than in reality, lacking dramatic power and being more a lecture than a literary work. It's very long and very hard to read, but despite this, within the mass of ore that it contains, there are some real nuggets of Platonic genius that are worthy of consideration. There's another extrinsic reason for paying some attention to the Laws, and it is that Aristotle's work in the Politics is a critical continuation from Plato's later work rather than from his earlier work. That being so, it helps to have some understanding of what Plato gets up to in these later dialogues. The Statesman is a late Platonic dialogue whose interlocutors are a young Socrates, the stranger Familia, and a mathematician, Theodorus. As a dialogue, it lacks the conversational liveliness of many of the earlier Platonic works. Statesmanship, or kingship, turns out to be a form of knowledge. Those familiar with Plato's thought will not be surprised at this, although the form of knowledge relevant to the statesman isn't without its practical dimension. The statesman's knowledge turns out to be the kind of knowledge that a herdsman has, the ability to care for his herd. A salient difference between, say, a shepherd and a statesman is that in the case of the latter, the herder and those who are herded are of the same species, while very few sheep interview for the job of shepherd. Another important difference is that the statesman is not concerned with the total care of his charges, but only with a partial form of this practical art, namely the ruling of cities. The metaphor shifts now so that the statesman is compared to a weaver. Plato gives an account of the different kinds of political rule that is uncannily like that given by Aristotle in the Politics. We can have rule by the one, by the few, or by the many. In each of these cases, the rule can be lawful and voluntary, or lawless and violent. Rule by the one, then, is either kingship or tyranny. Rule by the few is either aristocracy or oligarchy. Interestingly, Plato refuses to distinguish terminologically between legitimate and illegitimate rule by the many, calling both cases democracy indiscriminately. Since the task of the statesman is based on knowledge rather than on experience artfully developed, it turns out to be irrelevant whether or not those subject to the rule of the statesman give their consent to such rule. Just as in being treated by a physician, what is important is the physician's knowledge of health restoration and not the patient's view on the matter. What really matters is whether the rule of the statesman really benefits the public at large, and if this requires some tactical executions or banishments, then so be it. We might be somewhat shocked by this apparent realpolitik, and Socrates is shocked, but not so much by the suggestion that strong-arm tactics might be resorted to by the statesman as by the idea that rule without laws might be in order. The Eleatic stranger makes the point that laws are somewhat overrated, given that they are of necessity crude and general, whereas the living intelligence of the wise is flexible, adaptable, and can always take account of circumstances. One really bad thing about laws, the stranger thinks, is that they might be held to circumscribe the actions of the one possessing the kingly art. All this being so, it is better to have the lawless rule of the one rather than the lawless rule of the few or the many. On the other hand, a law-abiding rule of the many is inferior to the law-abiding rule of the few, which in turn is inferior to the law-abiding rule of the one. What the Eleatic stranger really wants is for our statesman to have the power to dispense with laws whenever he judges it wise to do so. Where does the weaver image fit into all this? Well, the task of the weaver is to combine the warp and the woof and to make cloth by keeping the tension right between the various strands. Similarly, the statesman's role is to keep the various elements in the polis in a kind of creative tension. Unlike the Republic, the statesman seems unconcerned with detailing the ideal state, concentrating on delineating the knowledge-based character of the ideal ruler. Nevertheless, those who know what's good for us better than we know this ourselves are to be conferred with the power to act, ruthlessly if necessary, but always for our good. We saw that Plato, in the Republic, thought of governance as a special task to be allocated to those with the right knowledge. If there are any such, then we have no need of law or rules. The Laws is a long, very long, and not particularly well-written dialogue, even by the relatively low literary standards of the late dialogues. Its first two books review the Spartan and Cretan codes of law, which explains why the Athenian stranger's interlocutors are a Cretan and a Spartan. Having reviewed the codes of Crete and Sparta, Plato begins his own account by giving us a sort of conjectural history of how men come to live together in society. The story he tells here, a move from a state of nature to society, from simplicity to complexity, from individuals to families to villages to the polis, is nothing very remarkable in itself, but it has the distinction of being one of the first of its kind. Power, or more properly authority, may be located in various more or less natural relationships: parents and children, age and youth, free and slave, noble and peasant, strong and weak, the elected and the rest, and, not least important, the wise and the ignorant, with the first in each pair being taken to exercise authority and legitimate power over the second. The last of these pairs, the wise and the ignorant, is the source of the authority that Plato would have instantiated in his ideal city, which he now thinks is practically unattainable, so that his task is now to devise a state which accommodates the various possible authoritative relations in some combination which best realizes justice. In the Callipolis of the Republic, Plato disbarred his guardians from the possession of private property and money and from the exercise of trades or engagement in commerce because of the corrupting and distorting effect such things would have on their ability to rule. His basic approach in the Laws is not wholly different, except that he has come reluctantly to accept the necessity of property and family to any actual society. If we cannot have a communistic system in Magnesia, then we will have an equal division of land that cannot be further divided or alienated, so that no one may accumulate more than their original allotment. Manual labour is still unbefitting the freemen and women of the city, and so we have the usual slaves to do such menial work. The exclusion of citizens from craft and commerce is still in place, such activities being undertaken by a class of resident aliens. And in a curious anticipation of measures taken during the 1930s New Deal, citizens may not have gold or silver. Only token money is permitted. The complicated details of the various levels of governance, such as the familiar guardians of the law and the sinister-sounding nocturnal council, need not concern us, save to say that, as might be expected, the result of the complicated system is to give relatively more power to the wealthier of the citizens of Magnesia within the severe limitations on wealth that obtain in the society. It seems reasonably clear that the Nocturnal Council, untrammeled by the restraints of law, is a kind of second-best substitute for the philosopher king of the Republic, and as such in conflict with the overall thrust of the Laws. The emphasis on education, so much a theme of the Republic, is found also in the Laws. The poets are still under suspicion, women are to be educated equally with men, and state-sponsored and state-regulated education is compulsory for all. Religion has an important role to play in the society of the laws, but it is a civic and frankly utilitarian religion that supports and validates the state by providing a basis for morality. Such a religion has three central tenets: that the gods exist, that they are concerned with our conduct, and, significantly, that they cannot be, as it were, bought off from exercising judgment on us by prayer and sacrifice. To deny any of these tenets is to be guilty of atheism, and atheists are to be subject to severe punishment. Perhaps the most alarming section of the laws for a lover of liberty is the section on punishment. Plato took from Socrates the doctrine that no one knowingly does wrong. That being so, the actions of wrongdoers must originate in ignorance. The cure for ignorance is education or re-education, so wrongdoers in Magnesia will not be punished, but rather cured. This sounds all very caring and concerned until you realize that those who refuse to be re-educated or are deemed incapable of it are to be killed. Plato's account, enlightened as it may sound, can be every bit as savage as the more openly retributive theories of punishment. In the end, the therapeutic theory of punishment consists in a refusal to recognize our freedom and to take from us, under the guise of an apparently gentler and more humane approach, the very thing that makes us human. We can be free and good, free and evil, but if we're not free, we can be neither good nor evil. In subscribing to the Socratic theory that evil cannot be chosen, Plato conflates a distinction between a subjective and an objective conception of the good. It is true, as Aquinas points out, that we act sub ratione boni, under the aspect of the good. At the moment of choice, it is necessarily the case that what we choose is for us at that moment a good. This subjective conception of the good is irrefutable. However, we know all too well that our choices, however good they may appear to us to be subjectively, are not always good objectively. Hence, the phenomenon of regret and remorse, and, pathetically, the existence in advertising of post-sales reassurance. What is objectively good is that which contributes to our genuine flourishing as creatures with body and mind, the main outlines of which are pretty much known to anyone who has lived in the world for more than a few minutes and has reflected on his life. The fundamental difference between the theory of the Republic and that of the laws, writes Sabine, is that the ideal state of the former is a government by specially chosen and specially trained men, quite untrammeled by any general regulations, while the state sketched in the latter is a government in which law is supreme, ruler and subject alike being subject to it. Putting laws back into a central position in the state is not, however, a minor addition which can be accommodated without much readjustment to the overall theory laid out in the Republic. It requires a major rethink of Plato's whole approach. Sabine writes, if the line of reasoning followed in the Republic was sound, there was no place in the state for law. Conversely, if a place had to be made for law, then there was nothing for it but to modify profoundly the whole philosophical structure and to admit principles which, to say the least, would greatly complicate it. Even so, Plato never explicitly abandoned his Republic position, and some commentators argue for an essential continuity between his earlier and his later work. Even as late as the Laws, Plato argues that law is essentially a blunt instrument that is insufficiently flexible to accommodate the fine details of individual circumstances, so that it would be better overall to have a competent ruler if one could be had. And that, of course, is the rub. By the time he comes to write the Laws, Plato seems to have despaired of ever finding such a ruler. Metaphysically, the divide between the ideal state governed by those who know and the second-best state governed by laws is a mirror image of the divide between true knowledge, which is of the permanent and unchanging forms, and sense perception, which is an apprehension of the ever-changing everyday world. That law belonged to the inferior side of this division would have been clearer in Plato's day, where law was essentially the contingent outcome of custom and habit rather than the legislative product of professional legislators. By the time Plato came to write his intermediate dialogue, The Statesman, which despite its name is only incidentally a work in political theory, he has still not abandoned the Republic's theory of the ideal state as the one ruled by those who know what is truly good and who are empowered to bring men to desire that good, even against their natural wishes and desires. However, though still thinking that the Republic's theory is the best, he is prepared to put forward a second best, an account that comes to fruition in the laws. Justice, by which Plato means giving and expecting from each man his due, is still the prime virtue, but it is to be developed not by the wise rule of those who know, but by laws which embody, in a detached and static way, the wisdom that would characterize the ideal ruler, if we could ever find such. As grudging and inconsistent as the law's account may be, it is nonetheless a revolutionary change in method for Plato, involving as it does an acceptance of the reality of the non-ideal, of the changeable and impermanent. Cutting Plato as much slack as we can, it is hard not to conclude that his political philosophy, whether early or late, is in the end totalitarian. Taking politics to be an exact science and arguing therefore that those with scientific knowledge must rule, his method is to conceive of a utopia and argue for its implementation. That this implementation will involve force and coercion does not deter him from his aim, for after all, the rulers in such a utopia will know what is good for all. Others might suspect that the implementation of such utopian plans would rather lead to a dystopia, a closed and repressive society. As Saunders writes, once you believe that you can isolate some sort of absolute moral aim, your great temptation will be to make a root and branch reform of society, whatever opposition you encounter, and refuse to tolerate other views which, ex hypothesi, are wrong. Millions of people have lost their lives or their livelihoods as a result of some of the more insane and nightmarish schemes of social re-engineering attempted by some states in the 20th century. One is only to recall China's ironically entitled Great Leap Forward, the USSR's disastrous attempts at collectivization, the romantic villagizations of Tanzania, Mozambique and Ethiopia, and the killing fields of Cambodia. James Scott believes that these schemes are among the great human tragedies of the 20th century in terms of lives lost and lives irretrievably disrupted. Of course, we can't blame Plato for these modern disasters, but the kind of thinking that led to them is a lineal descendant of Plato's own thought.